first glance, when you see what this story is about Herod killing John the Baptist, you look at it and go, man, what in the world does this have to do with me? This story has more to do with you than you think. The moment Herod heard those three words, John the Baptist, his previously sedate and seared conscience that hadn't bothered him in a long time awoke. You can always find people to approve of your sinful lifestyle, but that doesn't mean that it's right. And John the Baptist constantly spoke up to Herod and said, what you're doing's wrong. Herodias wanted John dead. But that's the last thing Herod wanted. Herod never wanted it to be this way, but the sin of his life and the sin in this moment caused it to go to a way that he never even planned. The story of Herod ends in Luke 23, but the story of Jesus doesn't. Jesus wants to offer you his grace. In all these things you face in your life, let me tell you this morning, you can finally be free.
Last time you'll remember, we saw Jesus send out his 12 disciples with the power to heal every sickness and disease, to cast out demons, to even raise the dead. They went out in pairs, 2 by 2, to different villages and different towns, and what they were doing was, well, it was supernatural. And word was being spread everywhere of what they were doing, and Herod heard of it. And when someone suggested to Herod that this was John the Baptist who'd been raised from the dead, suddenly his conscience shook him to the core. And he remembered the drinking and the dancing and the drunken decision and the completely unnecessary death of John the Baptist, beheaded and brought to him on a platter in front of all of his friends. Verse 29 tells us that John's disciples heard about what had happened to John. They came and got the body, and they took him and put him in a tomb. Matthew's account tells us that John's disciples went to Jesus, and they told Jesus. We pick up the narrative in verse 30, and would you stand for the reading of the word this morning? Mark chapter 6, verse 30. Mark says, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said 5, and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. You may be seated, and may God add his blessing to the reading of his word. Now, when we come to this passage, there are 4 things that stand out, at least to me, and hopefully they will to you. Number 1 is the ministry. Did you notice in verse 30, Mark begins with these words, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. The apostles. It's the first time they were called the apostles. But that's who they were. They had been disciples, now they were apostles. They had been sent out. They were under divine command, and they'd been given divine authority over disease and demons and even death. Well, they came back to Jesus, And they were like a bunch of schoolboys who had just been let out of school, and they couldn't wait to tell him everything that had happened. You know, I thought, wouldn't it have been great to have been there to hear what they said when they came back the very first time? I mean, imagine when you were speaking to a demon and the demon actually left, or when you said to someone, be well, and all of a sudden the disease left them. I mean, it had to be overwhelming to them. It would have been fun to listen to them come back and tell the Lord the people who had surrendered to God and the lessons that had been taught and the people who were no longer sick and the lives that had been changed. It would have been amazing. And in verse 31, Mark tells us that Jesus said to them, guys, you need to get away for a while. You need to rest. Come away to a desolate place and rest a while. Now, there are several points about ministry that we learn from what Jesus was saying to them. Why was he saying to them, well, when they come back and they've got all these great stories and they're telling him all this stuff, he says, guys, come on, we need to take a break. You need to rest. The first thing is that early triumphs make for easy targets. It would have been very easy for them to get puffed up, to start becoming proud and thinking, look at us, look what we've done. And perhaps Jesus wanted to mitigate that. Secondly, ministry can wear you out, especially when you're focusing on ministering to others. Sometimes you forget about your own emotional and spiritual and physical needs. Maybe he was trying to address that. Thirdly, rest and replenishment are essential if you want God to use you again. You know, one of Satan's favorite ploys is to let us wear down so we can't get back up. We become weary of the work, and we become weary in the work, and then we become weary of working for God anymore. We have to watch that. If you are an old-timer, and by that I'm speaking to my people now, you may remember years ago they had week-long events called revivals. Do any of you remember that? You remember the old-time revival? Okay, a bunch of you do. Revivals. I always thought it was kind of funny that by the end of the week, everyone was completely worn out from a revival. Vance Havner once said, if we don't come apart, we will come apart. He's right. He's also the one that said, you can't tell it like it is if you don't believe it like it was. He's right about that too. Jesus was teaching a very important principle. You need to renew your spirit and refresh your body if you're going to do things for God. Workaholism is not a spiritual gift. And it's not a very spiritual thing to do. Ministry can quickly turn to misery if you don't pay attention to your physical, emotional, and spiritual gauges. Dr. John Phillips said, and I quote, it is the Bible that divides our days into weeks, each week comprising 6 days for work and 1 day for rest. It is the wise provision of a loving God, one who knows how we are made and who makes provision for us to rest not only between each day, but also 1 out of 7, end quote. Remember the story of Elijah? And Elijah was on the run from Jezebel, and he finally got to the place where he was complaining to God. He wanted to die. He said, I'm the only prophet left who's serving you. Remember that? You know why he said that? Because he was worn out. You know why he was running from Jezebel? Because he was worn out. In fact, God said to him, Elijah, I have 7,000 prophets like you who have not bowed the knee to Baal. You're not the only one. 7,000. That's more than twice the number of seats in this room this morning. But see, he'd gotten worn out. He allowed his physical and emotional and spiritual gauges to be ignored, and he was depleted. And God sent an angel to him. Twice the angel encouraged him to rest and to eat. In fact, 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 7, the angel said to him, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. You're going to need some strength. You need to rest up before you do this. The apostles came back full of energy and excitement, but the Lord said, fellas, we need to get away and rest for a while. And so verse 32, it says, they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now Luke's account, Luke 9:10, tells us they went to a fishing village called Bethsaida. Now Bethsaida is interesting to us because that's the birthplace of, or the town where 4 of the apostles were raised. Andrew and Peter, Philip and Nathaniel. They grew up there. Bethsaida is also the village, the town, that Jesus pronounced a curse on them. In Luke chapter 10, verse 13, he said, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But it will be more bearable in the judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. Not only were 4 of the apostles from there, but there were works and miracles done there that most people would have said, wow, this is God, we got to repent, and they didn't. Well, verse 33 says, many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. In other words, when they knew that Jesus and the disciples had gotten in a boat, they saw where they were headed, they ran. They just literally left everything and just ran to be there when they arrived on the other shore. Well, verse 34 says, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd. Now, we'll see how big that crowd was in a moment, but I just want you to picture Jesus has told these disciples, we need to get away for some rest. They get in the boat. It's probably the early hours of the morning or late at night, and so they're traveling across the Sea of Galilee, this giant lake, and when they get to shore, this huge crowd is there. The second thing I want you to notice is the master. Jesus had told them they needed to get some rest, but when they reached the other side, all they could see for as far as they looked were people. Notice the Lord's response. Verse 34. He saw a great crowd and had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Jesus didn't say, oh no, turn the boat around. Let's get out of here. There's people here. Now, he didn't see people as an intrusion or an interruption. Mark says he saw them like sheep without a shepherd. How many of you know sheep without a shepherd are in trouble? They are. Sheep without a shepherd will die. Sheep can't find good pasture on their own. Sheep can't protect themselves from wolves and other predators. Sheep, when they fall on their back, they don't possess the ability to right themselves back on their feet without help. Sheep can't remove bugs or parasites or twigs or thorns or stickers out of their wool by themselves. Sheep are totally dependent on the shepherd to find food and water to sustain them. They might stumble on it accidentally, but it would be an accident if they did. Sheep can't rescue other sheep. They can follow sheep, but they can't rescue them. You need a shepherd for that. They are totally and completely dependent on the shepherd. Perhaps that's the reason why the Bible refers to you and I as sheep. Now, we think we can do all that stuff, but the fact of the matter is we can't. We're no different than sheep. We had a sheep out here this week. They had a little petting zoo for the Mother's Day out kids, and they had a little horse and a donkey and some other animals. They had a sheep, they had some goats. Now I walked over and I petted the sheep. I said, hey, we're just like each other. No, I didn't say that to him. I thought about saying, you're the dumbest animal in here, but he could have turned back and go, just like you. You know what Isaiah said in Isaiah 53:6? All we like sheep have gone astray. Each of us to his own way. We have turned, and the Lord has laid on him, Jesus, the iniquity of us all. Paul said to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20, verses 28 and 29, pay careful attention to yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God which he obtained with his own blood. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Jesus saw this massive multitude as sheep without a shepherd. So you know what he did? Mark says he started feeding them. Not physical food, the real food. He began teaching them the words of life. Mark says he began to teach them many things. In fact, most scholars believe he taught the majority of the day, as you'll understand later. Thirdly, notice the miracle. Now, this is a big miracle. There are only two miracles that are mentioned in all four Gospels. One of them is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Pretty important. You know what the second miracle is? This one. This was an important miracle. This was a massive miracle. This was so impressive a miracle that John tells us in his account that after the people saw it, they wanted to make him king. Why would they want to make him king? Now, you and I know the miracle is the feeding of the 5,000. And the reason why they wanted to make him king, who wouldn't want to have a king who could heal every disease you have? Keep you well all the time. Who wouldn't want to have a king who could cast demons out? Who wouldn't want to have a king who could raise your dead loved ones? Who wouldn't want to have a king who would provide food for you all the time, no matter what you wanted? They wanted to make him king. Now, Matthew tells us there were 5,000 men there. Luke says the same thing. So does Mark. But Matthew adds there were 5,000 men there besides women and children. So it's safe to assume there were 5,000 men, there were most likely 5,000 women, there were most likely 10,000 children, maybe more. So this is a crowd of between 20 to 25,000 people. Huge. And notice what happens with the men he chose. Verses 35 and 36, the apostles came to Jesus, Mark said, and they said, Lord, it's getting late. You need to send these people home so they can get something to eat. Now, I think it was the apostles who were hungry. Just a thought. Notice the method he used, verse 37. He began with their way. He said, you give them something to eat. You said, why did he begin with their way? He always does. He does the same thing with you and I. Why is that? Because we always want to do it our way first. Right? We'll fix this. We'll help this. We'll do this. We don't. And then when we can't do it, we go, God, could you help us? You know, you may know where the best resort is in the world, but I can tell you what the last resort is in the world is prayer. It's the last thing we do. We do all of our own stuff. Now you got to remember, the reason why Jesus did it their way first, remember these are the guys who had just come back and said, Lord, you can't believe all this stuff. I mean, the way we taught people, listen. And these people who were sick, they got well. And this one guy who was dead, I mean, he came alive. And it was, you know, they're telling all this stuff. So Jesus said to them, well, you go ahead and feed these people. I mean, remember who these were. Casting out demons, healing the sick, raising the dead. You give them something to eat. And they said, well, Lord, all we have is 200 denarii. That's 8 months' wages for one person. Even that wouldn't be enough money to buy food for all these people. Now, we get a little peek into the fact they had a treasurer, you know his name, Judas Iscariot, and they probably had 200 denarii in that little treasury bag they had. And so they're looking, they're going, Lord, we can't even afford to buy food for these people. They essentially said, Lord, there's no way we can do this, which is exactly where he wanted them to be. And it's exactly where he wants you and I to live. See, as long as we think we can do it, as long as we think we can fix it, as long as we think we can figure it out, we won't have to depend on him. We won't even have to pray. So he begins with their way. Then secondly, we notice his way. Now you want to know what his way is? His way is to use us. You know, wait a minute, I thought that was our way. No. He starts with their way. You give them something to eat. And then his way, he says, how many loaves do you have? Go see how many loaves you have. Come back. Let me see what you've got, and I'll see what I can do. He still uses them, but they know he's the master, and he's the one that will do the miracle. You know, ladies and gentlemen, we'd be amazed if we knew how many miracles that we have missed because we have failed to bring to God what we have. We fail to say, Lord, listen, everything I have, you got it. It comes from you anyway, but it's all yours. We fail to live according to Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. We've just ignored that, and we live our own deal and think it's all about us. And so we miss the miracles because we've never said, Lord, I'd like to see what you can do with what you've given me. But they come back and they have 5 loaves and they have 2 fish. Well, that's not much. We used to sing a song years ago, little is much when God is in it. When God's in the picture, everything changes. John tells us Andrew found this little boy who had 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Now, I want to be very clear. When I say loaves of bread, most of you think of something about this big, right? When I was a kid, we had Wonder Bread. I don't even know what it's called today. I still eat it, but I don't even know what it's called. But it used to be Wonder Bread, and I'm not talking about a kid with 5 loaves of Wonder Bread. We're talking about 5 barley crackers and 2 small fish. So it'd be like getting some, you know those little Ritz crackers that are about that big, and 2 little minnows. If you can just get that in your head, you're getting a pretty accurate picture of probably what he had. And that was lunch. Now, I'll take McDonald's over that any day, thank you very much. But that's what he had, these 5 little crackers, these 2 small fish. They bring them to Jesus, and John says that Andrew looked at that and he goes, but what are these among so many? In other words, his own disciples are saying to the creator of the universe, who created everything, this isn't going to work. Here's what we got, but this ain't going to happen. You know, I remember several years ago, we began talking about we need to provide more room for kids here. And our initial plan was to add a wing off this end of the building for children and add a wing off this end of the building for youth. Do any of you remember that? How many of you remember how many years ago that was? 5. And do you know how many people told me or posted something on Facebook or wrote an email to somebody or whatever and said, that'll never happen. And you know, next Sunday afternoon at 12:45, we're going to take a shovel and we're going to stick it in the ground and we're going to turn some dirt over. And as many people as want to have a shovel and turn some dirt over, and I hope it's every one of us. And then the following day, they're going to come in here and they're going to start work on a new $15 million children's building that's already paid for, and it won't be long, and that building will be out there. But now listen, when you put $20 in the chest of Joash out there, when you had some change one day as you walked out of church, and you put it in there, you probably didn't say it out loud, but you may have thought, well, this isn't much. This ain't going to make much of a difference. Now you get to see what God can do. Little is much when God is in it. Andrew said, Lord, this isn't much. With so many, how's this going to work? Well, that's why he's God and we're not. Amen? Notice the miracle he performed. Verse 39, he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. Now, I don't think he said, would you folks please be seated? I don't think he said that. He commanded them. And they all sat down. Now, I don't know how he did it. Maybe it was a look. Maybe it was a word. I don't know. But Mark says they sat down in groups of 50s and hundreds. And verse 41 says he took the barley loaves, the crackers, and he took the fish, and he looked up to heaven, and he said a blessing. How many of you pray before meals? Do you know that's biblical? Have you ever been at a restaurant or at your home and said, would you say the blessing? That's biblical. Jesus held up the barley loaves and the fish, and he said a blessing. The Bible tells us in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3, that all things are to be received with thanksgiving. You may think this is weird, but I travel a lot, and every once in a while I get upgraded to first class. There has not been a single time I walk down that little, whatever they call that metal thing you walk down to go to there's not been a single time I've walked down that without saying, God, thank you for this blessing. Not a single time. You know why? Because there's a ton of times I'm back in coach going, oh, great, what's this all about? You know. Do you thank God for your blessings? Do you thank Him for your health? Do you thank Him when we need the rain and the rain comes? Do you thank Him, or do you thank the weatherman? Now, I'm not saying you can't thank both, but you need to know where the rain comes from. It comes from God. Amen? And verse 41 says, He broke the loaves and He divided the fish and He gave them to the disciples to serve the people. Now, I want to be very careful here that you understand. There are some scholars who believe that nothing multiplies until Jesus blesses it. I'm one of them. I mean, I think if the disciples took these 2 fish and those 5 barley crackers, that'd been an awful small piece for you folks back there by the time we fed all these folks. But something happens when you get God's blessing on it. Something happens when you get God's blessing on a marriage. Something happens when you get God's blessing on a family. Something happens when you get God's blessing on a job. Something happens when you get God's blessing on a church. Something happens when you get God's blessing on a nation. Something happens. Why wouldn't we want the blessing of God? And so He blessed it. And He began to give to the disciples, and they began to serve the people. And they served them all. Now here's a small side note. You know, this was a miracle to feed 25,000 people, or however many, with 5 barley crackers and 2 small fish. That's a miracle. But there's also another miracle here. That the 12 apostles served all those people and didn't get in a fight. I mean, seriously. Remember, these are the same guys just a few months later who are going to be arguing over who's the greatest. Remember that? Now, when you think you're all that in a bag of chips, friend, listen, you are all that in a bag of chips and nothing more. But here they are serving 20 to 25,000 people. Which made me wonder this week, why is it that so many over time go from serving the Lord and serving others to serving themselves? Why is that? Well, verse 42 says, and they all ate and were satisfied. John says in John 6:35 that Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Friend, listen, if you come to Jesus, you're going to be satisfied. If you go to anybody else, you're not going to be satisfied. He's the only one. And whenever you give Him whatever you have, you're going to see Him miraculously provide for your needs in ways you never dreamed, you never thought possible. One of our ladies told me this morning, they're on fixed income, don't have much money, but they got a gas well or an oil well. And she told her husband, she said, you know, I think we ought to tithe off that. We ought to give 10% off that check every month. And she said, Pastor, told me this right after the last service. She said, Pastor, you know what happened to us? She said, I just picked an amount, and it was actually more than 10% of that check, and I started giving that every week, every Sunday, every time I came to church. And she said, you know what happened? The checks started getting bigger. She said, do you believe that? I go, yeah, I believe that. I've heard so many stories like that. Why wouldn't we want to give to God what we have so He could do the miraculous in our lives? Listen, He'll let you do your way if you want, but your way will never be as good as His. Never. Well, one more thing. Notice the meaning. Verse 43, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Now, this is impossible to miss. It's impossible to miss. Although they missed it. You said, wait a minute, how come they missed it and we didn't? Well, we have the perspective of history. They didn't. There's something else going on here. The precise number of baskets of fragments they're picking up is not a misprint. That's not some minuscule, unimportant matter. This was a deliberate act on the part of Jesus. He's drawing them a word picture or a visual reminder so they would know who He is. That's why John's gospel tells us that Jesus said, I am the bread of life come down from heaven. They were supposed to learn something from all this. But apparently they didn't. See, how do you know that? Well, if you'll look down in verse 52, the next section of Mark that we'll look at next time, Jesus comes walking to them on the water, and verse 52 says, they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves. See, if they knew God could miraculously provide all this food for all these people, they'd have no problem believing that the God who created water could walk on top of it. They missed it. See, they didn't get the fact that Jesus was God in human flesh, that He was and is Jehovah Jireh. There's something else here as well. 12 baskets full of broken pieces of bread. Why 12? Whenever the number 12 is used, it relates to the 12 tribes of Israel. In fact, Jesus said in Matthew 19:28, He chose 12 disciples that they might sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. In Mark 5, remember, we saw a woman who was healed of an issue of blood that she'd had for how many years? 12. And He raised a little girl from the dead who just happened to be how old? 12. No mistake. He's making a statement of who He was. And now there are 12 baskets of fragments to be picked up. He was reminding the disciples, He's the promised one. He's the provider sent by God. He's the Messiah. You say, well, was this a spiritual awakening for the disciples? No, if you look in your text, the Bible says they got back in their boat and they went to the other side. They missed who He was. They didn't fully understand who He was or what He could do. And so my question to you this morning is, will this be a spiritual awakening for you? Or will you get back in your car and go to the other side of town and miss who Jesus is and miss the miracles that you've been hoping and praying for? Let's pray.